As the snakemen ran up the stairs to meet him, their cruel crisp-blade swords ready to spill blood, they balked. Akmotesh's aura was palpable, and its sepulchral chill filled them with fear and repulsion. The priest took this opportunity to rush them, burying his sword in one and quickly moving toward the next. At this point, survival instinct overtook the snakemen's aversion, but they fought with a diminished vigor, as Akmotesh now appeared to them not as an escaping prisoner, but as a harbinger of death and doom, while the chill that surrounded them sapped their vigor. Gwala, meanwhile, had noticed his trusted friend's change of heart. He had learned not to question the Chemish priest's instincts, but rather rushed to his side without complaint, adding his sword arm to the Easterners. Most of the temple's denizens were cultists of Apsut, and not the most formidable of opponents, being equipped only with sacrificial daggers and robes. Nonetheless, being snakemen, they were still warlike and aggressive by nature, ready to defend their territory with savage fury, and dangerous if underestimated. In any case, they fell easy prey to the pair's swords and combat expertise, especially when subjected to the Chemite priest's aura of doom. One by one they fell, as Gwala and Akmotesh fought their way back into the temple, littering the stairs with their prone forms. Shortly, however, a small contingent of better-armed snakemen stormed into the chamber. These were armed in a similar manner to the prison guards, with undulating blades and boiled leather cuirasses. One of them stood out from the rest, being particularly large in stature and displaying the reticulated skin of a giant jungle snake. But Akmotesh and Gwala also received reinforcements as they battled their way down the stairs in the form of Vendar, who dashed to join the fray. Akmotesh had thought for sure he'd never see his former prison mate's face again, and yet here he was, fighting with the grace and ferocity of a well-trained, albeit slightly dirty, fighter, as he dodged and parried, delivering deft attacks with his commandeered sword, fistfuls of dirt into reptilian eyes, and vicious kicks to knees and groins. Having reached the bottom of the stairs, the three fought back to back, fending off the waves of attackers. The large snakeman guard approached Akmotesh, and seemed undaunted by the latter's colliginous aura. Though Akmotesh couldn't quite tell, he could swear the creature had a mocking smile on its reptilian face. The priest lunged at his opponent, who, with surprising deftness, avoided the blow just enough so that it caused only a superficial wound on its thick hide. It quickly grabbed Akmotesh's arm, wrenching the priest's weapon away and casting it aside with its own, before enfolding him in its massive arms and squeezing. Akmotesh felt as though the very life were being squeezed from his body. With his arms pinned to his sides, there was nothing to do. He was completely helpless. If he could only get his hands free just a little. With every ounce of energy still left in his body, he squirmed about, all the while feeling his reptilian foe's hot and putrid breath on his face. And then, finally, with a deft jerk of his arm, he managed to slide his hand into position, just close enough to place it on the ribs of the great sinewy beast that entrapped him. The death priest's tenebrous touch began to sap the life and vitality from the creature, and, as it did, the monster's vice-like grip on Akmotesh slackened. Soon he was able to slide out of the snakeman's death grip, snag its weapon from its scabbard, and use it to dispatch the owner. Still gasping for breath, Akmotesh rejoined his allies. Though outnumbered, they fought savagely, and it looked as though victory would soon be at hand. And then, from a thick velvet curtain behind the altar, out stepped a new figure. It was a serpent man, like those who had come before, but clothed in an elaborate robe of red velvet and purple silk, with intricate arabesques embroidered upon it. The creature's head was equipped with a large, cobra-like hood that was currently spread wide, showing off a pair of eye spots on its interior. Two large and billowy sleeves hung limply at the monster's side, with no hands extending from within. Meanwhile, behind and to the sides, stood a pair of guards, these ones wielding vicious-looking spears. As the snake priest regarded the scene before it, the sleeves at its sides began to wriggle and writhe in unnatural motions before rising into the air. The fabric of the sleeves fell back to reveal not arms as humans know them, but rather two wriggling, scaly necks topped with serpentine heads. Akmotesh had seen much in his times as a wandering priest in service of Anubis. Even so, he momentarily struggled to maintain his composure. He had heard rumors that certain members of the serpent people were endowed with strange and unsettling mutations, and that such mutants were often revered by their fellow serpent men, viewed as blessed by Apsut. This was the first time he had seen such a being in the flesh, the scaly, undulating flesh. The snake priest began chanting in its ancient and hissing language, and, as it did, Akmotesh became aware of a vile miasma that began to fill the chamber. "Poison gas! Don't breathe it in!" he cried as he slew one more of the snakemen acolytes. Sensing the urgency of the situation, Akmotesh dashed toward the steps of the altar as the snake priest's guards rushed down to meet him. Like their allies before them, they balked as they drew close to the death priest, but their dedication to their dark purpose spurred them on, albeit with diminished fervor. Their spears were a weapon to be reckoned with. With superior reach to Akmotesh's sword, he was hard-pressed to avoid their deadly plunges. He managed to turn away several attacks with the deft parries of his blade, but one of the spears managed to strike true, opening a wound in the Chemite's thorax. Maybe the wound missed any organs or arteries of import, but maybe they didn't. It was a strange truth that Akmotesh didn't seem to be affected by wounds and injuries quite the same as other men. Blades and points seemed to have a knack of missing vital areas. Certain injuries didn't bleed like they ought, and infections had difficulty taking hold in his body. Perhaps it was luck, or perhaps, as a living man who had learned to accept and serve death, he was somehow above such things. Regardless, the injury was painful, but he fought through it, grasping the spear with one hand, wrenching it up, and delivering a powerful kick to the wielder's now exposed torso. Gwala, meanwhile, had managed to resolve his previous engagements and had run to assist his friend. With a flick of his wrist, a sacrificial, crisp-bladed dagger wheeled through the air, finding its mark in the guard's face and causing it to fall to the ground in agony. Soon after, the henchman found its perhaps merciful end at the edge of Gwala's blade. The wound at Akmotesh's side was beginning to bleed a bit more generously now, and it was complaining with an angry, burning sensation. Nevertheless, he advanced up the stairs at the priest of Apsut, grim determination in his eye. The snakeman priest stood at the top of the stairs, awaiting the advance of the Chemite. As his foe neared, the beast's jaws opened wide in that disturbing way which only a snake's jaws can, and a torrent of vipers began to spill forth from the creature's detestable maw. It was unlike anything Akmotesh had seen. Did the priest of Apsut somehow have snakes living in its gut? Perhaps. It had snakes as arms, after all. But perhaps it was some form of unholy miracle, a perverse analog of Akmotesh's own masteries over the powers of life and death. Whatever the case, all that mattered now was that a tangle of venomous snakes was slithering down the steps toward him. Shoomp thunk! A spear sailed through the air and into the chest of the snakeman priest. It had come from the hand of Gwala, who had lifted it off one of the priest's own guards. The spear, along with the bow, knife, and blowgun, were among the hunter's favored weapons. He was deft with its usage and deadly with his aim. The serpentine arms of the priest coiled around the spear in a futile attempt to cope with the instrument that had caused its end, and the creature sank to the floor, its mouth agape as it gurgled a final malediction. As soon as the cleric of Apsut died, the foul cloud that had begun to fill the room started to dissipate. The summoned tangle of snakes, however, was still advancing down the stairs toward Akmotesh, descending in a writhing mass of sinew and scales. Their single-minded purpose and intent was something the priest had never observed in nature. Even the asps of Chem generally avoided people. These ones, however, seemed to have their minds bent on hostility. Akmotesh doubted his sword would be able to kill the many-headed beast that cascaded down the stairs. Quickly he observed his environment as he retreated. Flanking the steps were a series of braziers, their bowls housing smoldering coals. He waited until the cluster of snakes was almost upon him, and then, steeling himself for the pain he was about to experience, quickly snagged the nearest brazier. The pain was intense as the hot metal burned the flesh of his hands, but it was bearable knowing that he would be able to undo the damage easily enough. He had learned long ago that pain was mostly in the mind. If one knew the damage was only fleeting, it was much more tolerable. Quickly he emptied out the brazier upon the serpents as one might douse a fire with water. Only this time the water was fire, and the fire a mess of belligerent adders. Immediately the mass melted away as its members dissipated, spilling out over the steps or sliding around Akmotesh to flee from the red-hot embers. Shortly thereafter, the trio finished off the few remaining cultists and guards. "Is that all of them?" Vendar asked as he wiped sweat off his brow. "It would seem so," Akmotesh replied. Vendar allowed himself to breathe a sigh of relief. Suddenly, his expression changed to one of incredulous anger. "Are you mad?" he said. "We were almost out. Why did you run back in?" "You didn't have to follow us," said Akmotesh, "though I admire your valor. Why didn't you escape?" Vendar exhaled a sigh of resignation. "I don't know. I suppose it was just something they drilled into me during my days with the Legion. Never leave a man behind. Though they didn't specify if it was okay to make exceptions if the man in question was a complete lunatic. But you still didn't answer my question." "You said there was a girl. I had to make sure she wasn't dead." "I think she's long gone," Vendar said sadly but matter-of-factly. Akmotesh's injuries screamed for attention, but they'd have to wait for now. There were more pressing matters at hand. He walked up the steps toward the altar, stepping over the bodies of charred vipers and the corpse of the temple's priest. Carvings of snakes adorned the altar, and grooves ran through the surface and sides, channels made for the shunting of blood. He approached it, knowing a closer inspection would tell him what he needed to know. Akmotesh closed his eyes and lay his hands on its dark red stone, letting the blood stains speak to him, telling him their story. Though horrid acts had been performed in this altar, it had been some time since fresh blood had flowed over its stones. He opened his eyes. "If they killed her, they didn't do it here," he said. "Do you think they took her someplace else in the temple?" asked Vendar. Akmotesh furrowed his brow. "Perhaps." "Supposedly, this temple is used by the snake people as a reliquary for a sacred and powerful artifact of their cult, something called the Eyes of Apsut. I can only imagine it must be a jewel, or jewels, of great wealth. That's why I came here in the first place, except my sources told me the place was supposed to be ruined and abandoned. Imagine my surprise when I found it crawling, literally, with snakes. Pfft." Vendar snorted sardonically. "Anyway, it's possible there's more to this place that we haven't seen. If so, we might still have a chance to save her, but we need to move quickly." "I'm not so sure about accompanying you in some fool's errand into the depths of this temple," Vendar said. "And anyway, I'm not exactly in the best condition right now." He indicated several harsh wounds he had sustained. "We need to tend our wounds before we do anything else," agreed Akmotesh. Normally he carried a variety of unguents and balms, hieroglyph-etched fragments of linen, a golden ankh, lancets, and more to help with his medical obligations, but he had lost these during his capture. He would have to improvise. Quickly, the priest used what he had available, cutting ragged swatches of cloth from the garments of his fallen opponents, and mixing ash from the braziers with saliva and blood from his own wounds to create a sort of paste. Using these crude implements, he bandaged his wounds and those of his allies, all while uttering spells of healing and prayers to his god, after which he used the tip of a crisp-bladed dagger to anoint the dressings with the sacred glyphs taught him by his order. "I can feel my wounds healing even as we speak," Vendar marveled. "Are you some sort of sorcerer?" "I am a priest of Anubis, the Lord of Death," Akmotesh said. "Really? I had heard that many of the people of Kem were death worshippers, but I wasn't sure if it was true. Don't misunderstand me. I'm grateful for any allies I can get, but..." Though Akmotesh had the natural instinct of the faithful to speak out with vehemence in defense of his god, he had learned to understand the ignorance of foreigners in regard to a belief system to which they had little exposure. "Now that you've been healed, will you be parting ways with us then?" Vendar thought for a minute. "Well, I was thinking. I'm still interested in finding the Eyes of Apsut. If it's as legendary as they say it is, I'll never have to work again if I find it. And it just so happens that I'm an adventurer of no small skill. I'd be willing to give you my services if you help me find the eyes and give me a cut of any profits we make from looting this place." "I have little interest in the trinkets and treasures of this ephemeral existence," Akmotesh said simply. "Does that mean yes?" Akmotesh briefly glanced at Gwala, who clicked his opinion of their potential ally. "Any help you feel you have to offer would be appreciated," said the priest to his new friend. "Fantastic. With Vendar the Great by your side, we'll be an unstoppable team." The warrior deftly swished his sword through the air in a series of skillful-looking arcs. They neared the body of the prone snake man priest. Its grotesque serpentine arms were sprawled on the stairs around it. "An affront to nature," Akmotesh muttered. Gwala spoke in his alien tongue. "Agreed, friend," the Kemite said. "Perhaps keys or information." With much caution and a touch of revulsion, Akmotesh examined the corpse of the creature, but all the search turned up was a particularly ornate serpentine-bladed dagger, an amulet in the shape of a snake devouring the sun, and a pouch full of small, horseshoe-shaped bones. In contempt, he pulled the amulet off the priest's neck and cast it down the stairs. "Why do they all carry those strange bones?" Vendar asked, examining one of the U-shaped objects. "They are hyoid bones, bones found at the base of the human tongue. The serpent people take them as trophies from the men they kill and use them as currency. They don't have them on their own bodies, only cartilage and ligaments." "Ach!" Vendar dropped the bone in disgust. Akmotesh regarded the altar. For a moment he considered destroying it, or at least defacing its carvings. It was a foul thing made for a foul god. Though Anubis was a god of death, he would never revel in such wanton acts of violence and bloodshed. Quite the opposite, he loathed them. In fact, it was Anubis, legend said, who came to the savage lands of Kem when mankind was still young, to bring them the light of civilization and convince them to abandon the malignant and petty gods of old, whom they worshipped with offerings of flesh and blood. But time was of the essence, Akmotesh knew, and so he left the altar as it was, instead turning his attention to the red velvet curtain from which the priest had come earlier. The trio passed through this curtain and into what appeared to be a vestry. Various stone caskets and cabinets of dark wood could be found throughout, perhaps containing trappings and symbols of the serpent people's accursed cult. Near the sides were several terrariums, in which lazed adders and vipers of substantial girth. Meanwhile, the center of the room was dominated by a long altar populated by a variety of ceremonial daggers, scepters, chalices, and other relics, including a bowl of some sort of virulent-looking yellow liquid, most likely venom, Akmotesh guessed. But what captured the priest's attention more than anything were the items on the altar that were clearly not of the Apsusian cult. Rather, they were those of the priest of Anubis, and Akmotesh recognized these ones especially, for they were none other than his own. The first item was a bronze ankh, the symbol of life after death. It was a humble implement, yet its symbolism was powerful and had aided the priest many times in healing the living, sanctifying the dead, and banishing the dead that still lived. The second implement was a jackal head mask. This piece of ceremonial garb, fashioned in the likeness of his god's own visage and decorated with turquoise, doubled as a piece of war regalia, protecting his skull from sword and axe blows while instilling fear in his enemies. The final item was the great sickle-shaped sword of the kind used by the warriors and tomb guardians of the lands of Kem. It was larger and heavier than most of its ilk, being usable as both a one-handed and two-handed weapon. Akmotesh wasn't exactly sure when it was made or by whom, but its craftsmanship was of exquisite quality, with a blade made from steel that had been forged in a secret process few knew. This blade was etched with intricate hieroglyphics, forming spells of vanquishment, which allowed it to send the undead to their eternal rest, or to separate men's earthly bodies from their eternal ka, harvesting the lives of evil men in the same way a farmer's scythe harvested grain. It was from this final trait the weapon derived its name, Soul Thresher. "My belongings," Akmotesh said flatly, trying not to show his sense of relief and surprise. "What do the fork-tongues want with your things?" Vendar asked. "I thought they hated the gods of men, even Ereshkigal." "The materials are valuable. Perhaps they wanted to salvage them. It's also possible they wanted to desecrate them." Akmotesh ran his hands over the relics. Here and there, a vile-smelling whitish liquid seemed to have dried on them, likely excrement from the beast's cloacas. It was no matter, he concluded. It could be washed off easily enough in their blood. "Damn right they're valuable. Look at the workmanship on that sword and mask. I'm no expert appraiser, but a treasure hunter knows a good piece of loot when he sees one. Do you mean to tell me you were just going to leave these things behind?" "The implement served the man, not the other way around. No relic, no matter how ancient or precious, is worth more than a human life," Akmotesh said, as he fastened the ankh around his neck. Next, the priest donned his mask, reverently lifting it with both hands and placing it over his skull, where it enclosed his head in its familiar confines. He had long ago become accustomed to its weight and view, so that it no longer impeded him when he fought with it on. Adorned with his helm and ankh, Akmotesh finally grasped the hilt of Soul Thresher, feeling the familiar heft and weight of the well-balanced blade as he gave it a few gentle twirls. Now fully re-equipped, he was ready for anything the infernal temple could send his way. "I'm glad you're on my side," Vendar said as he regarded the priest in his full regalia.